In the mountains of Afghanistan, where death lurks behind every rock and betrayal hides in every shadow, Marcus Thompson was just trying to survive another day cutting hair at Forward Operating Base Chapman. He had traded his comfortable salon chair in small-town Ohio for a military contract that promised decent pay and a chance to serve his country in his own way. Nobody expected much from the quiet civilian hairdresser who kept the soldiers looking sharp before their dangerous missions. But when 52 Taliban fighters surrounded a trapped Navy SEAL team in a valley that had become their graveyard, and when every trained soldier was either dead, wounded, or pinned down by enemy fire, it would be Marcus, the man who knew more about scissors than rifles, who would make the choice that separated heroes from bystanders. This is the story of how an ordinary hairdresser became the difference between life and death for America's most elite warriors, proving that courage doesn't always come in combat boots, and sometimes the most unlikely people rise to meet the most impossible moments. Marcus Thompson never imagined that his steady hands, trained to hold scissors and razors with precision, would one day hold the lives of Navy SEALs in their grasp. Back in Millfield, Ohio, his biggest worry was whether Mrs. Henderson would complain about her perm again, or if the high school football team would show up all at once before homecoming, creating chaos in his small salon on Main Street. The decision to leave his comfortable life behind came during one of those quiet Tuesday afternoons when the shop was empty except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic. Marcus had been cutting hair for 15 years, inheriting the business from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. 3 generations of Thompsons had made their living making people look good in a town where not much ever changed. But Marcus felt something missing, a restlessness that grew stronger after his divorce and his daughter's departure for college. When he saw the job posting for civilian contractors needed at military bases overseas, something clicked. The pay was 3 times what he made at home, and they specifically needed barbers and hairdressers to serve the troops. It seemed like a way to do something meaningful while still using the skills he had spent his lifetime perfecting. His sister Sarah thought he had lost his mind. "You're going to a war zone to cut hair?" she asked, standing in his kitchen with her arms crossed, the same stance she had taken when they were kids, and she disapproved of his plans. "Marcus, you've never even been camping, let alone to Afghanistan." She was right about the camping part, but Marcus had made up his mind. He sold his share of the salon to his longtime business partner, said goodbye to the only life he had ever known, and signed a 1-year contract with Blackwater Services. 6 weeks later, he was on a transport plane heading to Forward Operating Base Chapman, watching the Ohio farmland disappear beneath clouds that seemed to carry him toward a different world entirely. Afghanistan hit him like a physical blow. The heat, the dust, the constant background noise of helicopters and distant explosions, the smell of diesel fuel and unwashed bodies, and something else he couldn't identify, but later learned was the scent of a place where death was always close. Chapman was a sprawling collection of concrete barriers, prefab buildings, and tents surrounded by razor wire and guard towers, home to about 3,000 American and Allied forces. Marcus's barbershop was a converted shipping container with 2 chairs, mirrors salvaged from a bombed-out building in Kabul, and shelves lined with military-issue shampoo and basic grooming supplies. It wasn't much, but it became one of the most popular places on base. Soldiers would line up for haircuts, not just because they needed to maintain military appearance standards, but because those 20 minutes in Marcus's chair were 20 minutes of normal conversation, of feeling human again. He learned their names, their stories, their fears. Private Rodriguez talked about his girlfriend back in Texas, who sent him letters perfumed with her favorite scent. Sergeant Williams showed him pictures of his newborn son he had never held. Captain Davis, a Marine who had been deployed 4 times, admitted that he'd dreamed about his mother's kitchen more than anything else in the world. But it was the Navy SEALs who fascinated Marcus most. They came in quietly, usually late in the evening when the regular troops had finished their shifts. Team Alpha was led by Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, a career military man whose calm presence seemed to steady everyone around him. His team included Chief Petty Officer Mike Bear Kowalski, a massive man with gentle eyes who spoke softly about his wife and twin daughters. Petty Officer First Class David Shun, a sniper whose precision Marcus admired professionally. And Petty Officer Second Class Tony Ramirez, the youngest of the group, who still looked like he should be in high school, despite his lethal training. These men operated in a different realm than the regular soldiers. While others fought battles, the SEALs conducted surgical strikes deep behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence, eliminating high-value targets, and performing rescue operations that never made the news. They carried themselves differently, spoke differently, and when they sat in Marcus's chair, they shared different kinds of stories. Morrison talked about the responsibility of leading men into situations where split-second decisions meant the difference between everyone going home or body bags on transport planes. Bear showed Marcus pictures of his girls' soccer games and worried about missing too much of their childhood. Chun described the strange intimacy of watching targets through a scope, knowing details about their daily routines, their families, their habits, before taking the shot that would end their lives. Ramirez, despite his youth, carried an old soul's understanding of mortality that came from seeing too much death too young. Marcus found himself staying late to accommodate their schedules, learning about their missions through careful conversations that danced around classified details. He began to understand the rhythm of their deployments, the tension that built before operations, the exhaustion that followed successful missions, and the haunted silence that came after the ones that went wrong. It was during one of these late-night sessions that Morrison first mentioned the Karengal Valley. Bear was in the chair, getting his usual crew cut before a mission that would take them deep into Taliban territory. The valley, Morrison explained while cleaning his sidearm, was called the Valley of Death by American forces. It was a narrow corridor surrounded by steep mountain walls, perfect for ambushes, where the Taliban had turned every cave and ridge into a fortress. "We've lost more good men in that valley than anywhere else in this godforsaken country," Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience. "The terrain makes everything harder. No clear landing zones for choppers, limited sight lines, and the enemy knows every rock and hiding spot. It's like fighting ghosts who can materialize anywhere and disappear just as fast." Chin nodded grimly. "Last month, Charlie team got pinned down there for 18 hours. Lost 2 men before Apache gunships could clear enough Taliban positions to get them out. The enemy just keeps coming, like they have an unlimited supply of fighters willing to die for that piece of ground." Marcus listened while he worked, his scissors moving automatically through Bear's thick hair while his mind tried to process what these men faced every time they left the wire. Back in Ohio, his biggest occupational hazard had been the occasional nick from a razor or repetitive stress from standing all day. These men calculated odds of survival, planned for worst-case scenarios, and said goodbye to each other knowing it might be permanent. The conversation stayed with him that night as he lay in his narrow cot, listening to the generators humming outside and the distant sound of outgoing artillery. He thought about Bear's twin daughters, about Morrison's quiet leadership, about Chin's deadly precision, and about young Ramirez, who carried himself like a veteran despite barely being old enough to vote when he enlisted. 3 days later, Team Alpha departed before dawn for another classified mission. Marcus watched their helicopter disappear into the pre-dawn darkness, carrying 4 men he had come to respect and care about into dangers he could barely comprehend. He went about his normal routine that day, cutting hair and listening to soldier stories, but part of his attention remained focused on the empty chairs where his SEAL friends usually sat. The base felt different when elite teams were deployed. There was an undercurrent of tension, a collective holding of breath while everyone waited for word that the mission was complete and the men were safe. Marcus had learned to read these signs over his months at Chapman. The way conversations became more subdued, the way people checked their watches more often, the way radio operators seemed more focused on their equipment. It was late afternoon when the first reports started filtering through unofficial channels. A SEAL team was in trouble somewhere in the mountains. The details were classified, but rumors spread quickly through a base where everyone knew someone who knew someone with access to communications. Marcus felt his stomach tighten as he closed his shop for the day, hoping against hope that it wasn't Team Alpha, knowing in his heart that hope and reality didn't always align in a place like Afghanistan. That evening, he sat outside his quarters watching the sun set behind the mountains that held so many secrets and so much danger. The peaks looked beautiful in the golden light, their harsh edges softened by distance and the forgiving glow of dusk. It was hard to believe that those same mountains were hiding men who wanted to kill his friends, men who were perhaps at that very moment lining up shots or planning ambushes. The base loudspeaker crackled to life just as full darkness settled over Chapman. All personnel report to designated stations. This is not a drill. Repeat, all personnel report to designated stations. Marcus felt his heart rate spike as soldiers began running past his position, their equipment clattering as they moved with practiced urgency toward whatever crisis was unfolding. He made his way to the communications building, where a crowd of support personnel had gathered, all of them wearing the same expression of controlled worry that came with caring about people whose jobs regularly placed them in mortal danger. The news, when it came, was worse than anyone had feared. Team Alpha was trapped in the Korangal Valley, surrounded by an estimated 52 Taliban fighters who had turned the narrow corridor into a killing ground. 2 helicopters sent for extraction had been forced back by heavy fire, one taking significant damage that forced an emergency landing 20 miles away. Air support was limited by the terrain and the risk of friendly fire, leaving 4 Navy SEALs pinned down with limited ammunition and no clear route of escape. Marcus stood in that crowd of worried faces, listening to fragmentary radio transmissions that painted a picture of desperation in the mountains. Morrison's voice came through occasionally, calm and professional even as he described their deteriorating situation. Bear was wounded, shot through the shoulder, but still fighting. Chun had taken a position where he could cover their small perimeter, but his ammunition was running low. Ramirez, the youngest member of the team, was moving between positions, doing whatever needed to be done to keep his teammates alive. As the night wore on, the situation grew more desperate. Additional rescue attempts were being planned, but the Taliban had reinforced their positions, bringing in more fighters and heavier weapons. The SEAL team was now completely surrounded, low on ammunition, with 1 man wounded and no prospect of immediate rescue. Marcus returned to his quarters sometime after midnight, but sleep was impossible. He lay on his cot staring at the ceiling, thinking about the 4 men he had come to know not as legendary warriors, but as human beings with families and fears and hopes for the future. Bear's twin daughters who would grow up without their father if this went wrong. Morrison's sense of responsibility for his men. Chen's quiet professionalism. Ramirez's youth and the life he had barely begun to live. The hairdresser from Ohio had no military training, no weapons training, no experience with combat operations. But he had steady hands, a clear head under pressure, and something that was growing stronger by the hour. The absolute certainty that he could not stand by and do nothing while good men died in the mountains. Not if there was any chance, no matter how slim, that he could make a difference. By morning, Marcus Thompson had made a decision that would change everything. The quiet civilian contractor who had come to Afghanistan to cut hair was about to discover what he was truly capable of when people he cared about needed him most. The mountains were calling, and for the first time in his life, Marcus was ready to answer. The morning briefing painted a grim picture that grew darker with each passing hour. Team Alpha had been trapped for over 14 hours now, and every rescue attempt had been repelled by concentrated Taliban fire. The enemy had positioned fighters on the ridge lines surrounding the valley, creating overlapping fields of fire that made helicopter insertion impossible and ground assault suicidal. Marcus stood at the back of the briefing room, officially having no business being there, but nobody questioned his presence among the support staff and off-duty personnel who had gathered to hear updates about the trapped SEALs. Colonel Matthews, the base commander, stood before a tactical map marked with red symbols indicating enemy positions and a small blue dot showing where Team Alpha remained pinned down. "Gentlemen, I won't sugarcoat this," Matthews said, his weathered face showing the strain of command decisions that affected real lives. "We have 4 of our best people trapped in terrain that favors the enemy. Every conventional rescue option has been tried or evaluated, and none offer acceptable chances of success without significant casualties among rescue forces." The silence in the room was heavy with frustration and helplessness. These were professional soldiers, trained to solve problems through action, and being told there was nothing they could do when against everything they believed about leaving no one behind. Captain Rodriguez, the operations officer, stepped forward to brief the latest intelligence. Satellite imagery shows the Taliban have established fighting positions in a horseshoe pattern around the valley floor. They've got machine gun nests, RPG teams, and what appears to be a mortar position on the North Ridge. Any helicopter trying to extract our people would be flying into a wall of fire. "What about the AC-130?" someone asked, referring to the heavily armed gunship that could circle above the valley and rain destruction on enemy positions. "Negative," Matthews replied grimly. "The terrain is too steep, and our people are too close to enemy positions. Risk of friendly fire is unacceptable. We're not trading 4 lives for 4 lives." Marcus felt his hands clench into fists as he listened to the clinical discussion of why his friends are going to die. Every option presented seemed to end with the same conclusion. The terrain made rescue impossible. The enemy positions were too strong. The risk to additional personnel was too great. The military's careful calculations and risk assessments were reaching the same mathematical conclusion that Marcus's heart refused to accept. As the briefing broke up, Marcus approached Major Williams, the Special Operations Liaison who coordinated with the SEAL teams. Williams was a compact man with intelligent eyes and the kind of calm demeanor that came from years of dealing with impossible situations. "Major, I need to talk to you about something," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. Williams looked surprised to see the base barber seeking him out, but he nodded toward a quiet corner of the room. "What's on your mind, Thompson?" Marcus took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to propose would sound crazy to a trained military officer. "I want to volunteer for a rescue mission." The major's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained professional. "Marcus, I appreciate the sentiment, but This isn't something civilians get involved in. We have trained personnel for rescue operations. With respect, sir, your trained personnel can't get to them, Marcus replied, his voice gaining strength as he worked through the idea that had been forming in his mind all night. Every approach you're considering involves helicopters or large ground forces. What if we're thinking about this wrong? Williams studied him for a moment, perhaps recognizing something in Marcus's expression that suggested this wasn't just emotional reaction, but careful consideration. What are you thinking? Marcus moved closer to the tactical map, still displayed on the briefing room wall. Look at this terrain, he said, pointing to the steep mountainsides surrounding the valley. Everyone's focused on the valley floor because that's where vehicles can operate and helicopters can land. But what if someone approached from above, from the backside of these ridges? The Taliban have observers on the high ground, Williams pointed out. They'd spot any approaching force long before they could get into position. Not a force, Marcus said quietly. One person, someone who knows how to move quietly, who isn't carrying heavy military equipment, who doesn't look like a threat until he's close enough to make a difference. Williams was quiet for a long moment, studying the map with the kind of tactical mind that could see possibilities others might miss. Even if someone could get close, then what? One person can't fight 50 Taliban fighters. Marcus had been thinking about that problem all night, turning it over in his mind like a puzzle that needed solving. I don't need to fight them all. I need to create enough confusion and chaos to give our people a chance to break out of the kill zone. If I could take out their machine gun positions or create a diversion that forces them to shift their focus, maybe that's enough. The major shook his head slowly. Marcus, you're talking about a suicide mission. You don't have military training, you don't have combat experience, and you'd be going up against professional fighters on their home ground. You're right, Marcus admitted. I don't have military training, but I do have something else. I know those 4 men personally. They're not just mission objectives to me, they're friends. And sometimes that matters more than training. Williams studied Marcus with new interest, perhaps seeing something he hadn't expected in the quiet civilian contractor. What kind of support would you need? The question surprised Marcus, who had expected immediate rejection. Basic equipment, night vision if possible, a radio to coordinate with the team, and whatever weapons you think I can handle without getting myself killed immediately. And if I said yes, which I'm not saying I am, how would you get to the target area? Marcus pointed to a spot on the map about 10 miles from the valley. Drop me here at this logging road the locals use to move timber down from the high country. I can hike in from the backside of the ridge, approach the Taliban positions from behind. They're focused downward, watching for helicopters and ground assault. They might not expect someone coming from above. Williams was quiet for several minutes, his tactical mind working through the implications of what Marcus was proposing. It was unconventional, risky, and went against every standard operating procedure in the manual. But conventional approaches weren't working, and for good men were running out of time. Wait here, Williams said finally, then walked away to make a phone call that Marcus couldn't hear, but suspected would determine whether his crazy plan had any chance of becoming reality. 30 minutes later, Marcus found himself in Colonel Matthews' office, facing the base commander across a desk covered with intelligence reports and tactical assessments. Matthews was a career officer who had risen through the ranks by making smart decisions under pressure, and Marcus could see him weighing risks and possibilities with the kind of calculation that came from years of command responsibility. Major Williams tells me you have an unconventional proposal, Matthews said, his voice neutral but interested. Marcus repeated his idea, this time with more confidence and detail. He had spent the waiting time thinking through every aspect of the plan, anticipating objections, and preparing responses. When he finished, Matthews leaned back in his chair and studied him with eyes that had seen enough war to recognize both courage and foolishness. Son, what you're proposing is extremely dangerous. The likelihood of success is minimal, and the chances of you coming back alive are even smaller. Why would you want to do this? Marcus thought about Bear's twin daughters, about Morrison's quiet leadership, about Chen's deadly precision, and about young Ramirez, who reminded him of his own nephew. Because they're my friends, sir. Because someone needs to try. Because if I don't try and they die, I'll have to live with that for the rest of my life. Matthews nodded slowly, recognizing the kind of motivation that couldn't be taught or faked. If I authorize this, it would be completely unofficial. You'd be operating without military sanction, without backup, and without the protections of the Geneva Convention if you're captured. I understand, sir. And if you get killed, we'll have lost a good barber and gained nothing. Yes, sir. Matthews was quiet for a long time, staring out his office window at the mountains that held so many secrets and so much danger. When he turned back to Marcus, his decision was clear in his expression. Major Williams will get you equipped and briefed on communication protocols. You leave at nightfall. God help us all. The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparation that felt surreal to a man whose biggest previous challenge had been managing the rush of customers before prom night. Marcus was fitted with body armor that felt impossibly heavy, taught basic radio procedures, and given a crash course in the M4 carbine that would be his primary weapon. Sergeant First Class Martinez, a Special Forces veteran who volunteered to help with Marcus's preparation, didn't sugarcoat the challenges ahead. Listen, Thompson, I admire what you're trying to do, but you need to understand what you're walking into. These Taliban fighters aren't weekend warriors. They know the terrain, they're experienced fighters, and they've been preparing for this kind of fight their whole lives. Marcus nodded, checking the unfamiliar weight of the rifle in his hands. What advice can you give me? Move slow, move quiet, and think before you act. Your biggest advantage is that they won't expect you. Don't waste it by being careless or rushing. And remember, your job isn't to win a gunfight. Your job is to create enough confusion to give the SEALs a chance to fight their way out. As evening approached, Marcus found himself standing beside a helicopter that would carry him to the drop zone. The aircraft looked massive and lethal, nothing like the civilian helicopters he had occasionally seen back in Ohio. Major Williams walked up beside him, carrying a radio and a set of night vision goggles. Last chance to change your mind, Williams said, his voice carrying genuine concern for the civilian who was about to attempt something that would challenge experienced soldiers. Marcus looked toward the mountains, thinking about the 4 men who had trusted him with their stories and their fears during quiet evenings in his makeshift barbershop. I'm not changing my mind. The helicopter ride to the drop zone took 45 minutes, flying low through valleys and between peaks that looked like sleeping giants in the growing darkness. Marcus sat strapped into a seat that had carried countless soldiers into combat, wearing equipment he had never imagined using, heading toward a confrontation that would test every aspect of his character. The pilot, a Warren officer named Johnson who had flown extraction missions throughout Afghanistan, turned to Marcus as they approached the drop zone. Thompson, you've got brass. I'll give you that. But brass doesn't stop bullets. Be smart out there. The helicopter touched down in a clearing barely large enough to accommodate its rotor span, and Marcus jumped out into the Afghan night. The aircraft lifted off immediately, its rotor wash, stirring up dust and debris before disappearing into the darkness, leaving Marcus alone in hostile territory with nothing but his determination and a plan that seemed much less solid now that he was actually implementing it. The silence after the helicopter departed was profound, broken only by distant sounds that could have been whined through rocks or could have been human movement. Marcus adjusted his night vision goggles, shouldered his rifle, and began the long hike toward the Karengal Valley, where 4 Navy SEALs waited for a miracle that might come in the unlikely form of their barber. The mountains of Afghanistan had claimed countless lives over the centuries, but tonight they would witness something unprecedented. A hairdresser from Ohio walking deliberately toward a fight that would determine whether courage was something you were born with or something you discovered when people you cared about needed you most. The hike through the Afghan mountains at night was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. Every sound seemed amplified through his night vision goggles. Every shadow could hide an enemy fighter, and every step forward brought him closer to a confrontation that his rational mind insisted he couldn't survive. But rational thought had given way to something deeper and more primitive, the absolute certainty that he would rather die trying than live knowing he had done nothing while his friends were murdered. The terrain was brutally difficult, even worse than the maps had suggested. Loose shale shifted under his boots, threatening to send him tumbling down slopes that dropped away into invisible valleys. Thorny scrub caught at his clothing and equipment, and the thin mountain air left him gasping despite months of acclimatization to Afghanistan's altitude. His civilian fitness, adequate for cutting hair and walking around a small town, was being tested in ways he had never imagined. But Marcus pressed on, driven by fragments of radio transmissions he had monitored before leaving the helicopter. Morrison's voice, growing hoarser with each report, describing their deteriorating situation. Bear, wounded but still fighting, conserving ammunition for shots that had to count. Chun, methodically picking off Taliban fighters who exposed themselves, but running dangerously low on ammunition. And young Ramirez, barely 22 years old, moving between positions and doing whatever needed to be done to keep his team alive. After 3 hours of climbing, Marcus reached the ridge line that overlooked the Karengal Valley. What he saw through his night vision took his breath away and made his heart sink simultaneously. The Taliban had indeed established a horseshoe of fighting positions around the valley floor, just as the intelligence reports had indicated. But seeing it in person, understanding the tactical reality of what Team Alpha faced, made their situation seem even more hopeless. Machine gun positions were dug into the rocky outcroppings, their fields of fire overlapping to create a killing zone that no helicopter could penetrate. RPG teams had positioned themselves where they could engage any aircraft attempting extraction. And scattered throughout the Taliban positions, Marcus could see individual fighters moving between cover, at least 50 men committed to ensuring that the 4 Americans trapped below would not leave the valley alive. Through his radio, Marcus could hear the SEALs' increasingly desperate situation reports. They had found cover behind a cluster of boulders near the center of the valley floor, but their position was completely exposed to fire from above. Morrison estimated they had perhaps 2 hours of ammunition remaining if they continued their current rate of fire. After that, they would be defenseless against an enemy that showed no signs of retreating. Marcus studied the Taliban positions through his night vision, his barber's eye for detail serving him unexpectedly well as he analyzed the tactical situation. The enemy fighters were focused downward, concentrating their attention on the trapped SEALs and watching for rescue helicopters. Their rear areas, the positions Marcus was approaching from above, seemed less heavily defended. Moving with the careful precision he had learned from years of handling sharp instruments around people's necks, Marcus began his descent toward the Taliban positions. Every step had to be calculated, every movement deliberate. The loose rock and steep slopes that had made his climb so difficult now became allies, allowing him to approach the enemy positions from an angle they weren't expecting. His first target was a machine gun nest positioned on a rocky outcropping that commanded a clear view of the valley floor. Two Taliban fighters occupied the position, one operating the weapon while the other fed ammunition belts and watched for targets. They were perhaps 30 yards from Marcus's position, close enough that he could hear their quiet conversation in Pashto as they discussed the trapped Americans below. Marcus had never killed anyone in his life. His hands, steady enough to trim around a child's ears or shape a beard to perfection, trembled slightly as he raised his rifle and tried to remember everything Sergeant Martinez had taught him during their brief training session. The safety was off, the weapon was loaded, and two men who wanted to kill his friends were centered in his scope. The first shot surprised him with its violence, the rifle's recoil and the sharp crack of the round echoing off the mountainside. The Taliban fighter operating the machine gun pitched forward, and his companion spun around, searching for the source of the attack. Marcus's second shot was more deliberate, more accurate, and more final. The silence that followed seemed to last forever, though Marcus knew it was only seconds before the Taliban positions erupted in confused activity. Shouts echoed across the mountainside as fighters tried to determine where the attack had come from, and suddenly, the disciplined focus on the trapped SEALs was replaced by chaotic attempts to identify this new threat. Marcus was already moving, using the confusion to advance to his next target. The element of surprise, his single greatest advantage, was quickly evaporating, but he had succeeded in the most important objective, shifting the enemy's attention away from Team Alpha and giving the SEALs their first opportunity in hours to take offensive action. Morrison's voice crackled through the radio, professional calm intact despite their desperate situation. Unknown friendly, this is Alpha Team Leader. Identify yourself and your position. Alpha Leader, this is Scissors, Marcus replied, using the call sign he had chosen during his brief radio training. I'm on the North Ridge, approximately 200 meters above your position, beginning diversionary attacks on enemy positions. There was a moment of silence before Morrison responded, and Marcus could hear the surprise in the SEAL commander's voice. Scissors, are you the crazy Barbara Williams told us about? That's affirmative, Alpha Leader. Jesus Christ, Thompson, what the hell are you doing up there? Before Marcus could respond, Taliban fighters had located his approximate position and began returning fire. Bullets cracked overhead and sparked off the rocks around him, forcing him to dive for cover behind a boulder that seemed inadequately small for someone being shot at by dozens of people. Alpha Leader, I'm going to continue moving along the ridge line, hitting targets of opportunity. When I create enough confusion, you need to be ready to move to better cover. Negative, Scissors. You need to extract immediately. This is not your fight. Marcus peered around his boulder, studying the Taliban positions that were now oriented toward his location instead of the valley floor. For the first time since Team Alpha had been trapped, they had a tactical advantage, and he wasn't going to waste it. With respect, Alpha Leader, it became my fight when they trapped my friends. Scissors out. Marcus began moving again, using his knowledge of the terrain gained during his approach to stay ahead of the Taliban fighters who were now hunting him. His next target was an RPG team position where they could engage rescue helicopters, two men with a weapon that could destroy an aircraft and everyone aboard it. The approach was more dangerous now that the enemy was actively searching for him, but Marcus used techniques he had never learned in barber school, moving when the wind stirred the scrub brush to mask the sound of his movement, pausing behind cover when Taliban fighters passed close to his position, and timing his attacks to coincide with the enemy's moments of greatest confusion. His attack on the RPG position was swift and decisive. 2 quick shots eliminated the threat, and Marcus was moving again before the Taliban could organize a response. But each attack revealed more about his position, and the enemy was adapting, sending teams to sweep the ridge line where they suspected the lone gunman was operating. Through his radio, Marcus could hear Team Alpha beginning to take advantage of the chaos he was creating. Bear, despite his wound, had moved to a position where he could provide covering fire. Chun was using his sniper skills to pick off Taliban fighters who exposed themselves while searching for Marcus. And Morrison was coordinating their movements, preparing for a breakout attempt that would have been impossible while the enemy maintained their disciplined focus on the valley floor. But Marcus's ammunition was running low, his position was becoming increasingly compromised, and the Taliban were beginning to coordinate their response to his attacks. What had begun as a successful diversionary action was rapidly becoming a last stand for a barber who had never expected to find himself in a gunfight on an Afghan mountainside. His radio crackled with Morrison's voice, urgent and commanding. "Scissors, we're ready to move. Can you create one more major distraction?" Marcus looked around his current position, a shallow depression in the rocks that provided minimal cover from the Taliban fighters who were closing in on his location. He had perhaps 6 rounds remaining in his rifle, no grenades, and no realistic chance of fighting his way out of the trap that was tightening around him. But looking down at the valley floor, he could see Team Alpha preparing for their breakout attempt. For professionals who had dedicated their lives to serving their country, for men with families and futures and reasons to live, for friends who had trusted him with their stories during quiet evenings in his barbershop. Alpha leader, affirmative. Give me 30 seconds, then move fast and don't look back. Marcus emerged from his cover position and began firing at every Taliban position he could identify, not try to conserve ammunition or find perfect shots, but simply creating as much noise and chaos as possible. Return fire immediately focused on his location, bullets cracking past his head and chipping rock fragments from the stones around him. Through his peripheral vision, he saw Team Alpha beginning their movement, using the distraction he was providing to bound between covered positions as they fought their way toward the southern end of the valley, where extraction might be possible. Bear was moving despite his wound. Chun was providing precision covering fire. Ramirez was carrying extra equipment, and Morrison was coordinating their movement like the professional he was. Marcus's rifle ran dry, and he reached for his sidearm, knowing that his pistol would be inadequate against the assault rifles and machine guns now converging on his position. But he had accomplished what he came to do. His friends were moving, they had a chance, and sometimes that was all anyone could ask for. The Taliban fighters were close now, close enough that Marcus could hear their individual voices as they called to each other, coordinating their final assault on the position where the lone American had made his stand. He had perhaps 10 rounds in his pistol, no grenades, and no reasonable expectation of survival. But as he prepared for what seemed like his final fight, Marcus heard a sound that changed everything. The distinctive whop-whop-whop of helicopter rotors echoing off the mountain walls. Not one aircraft, but several approaching fast and low through the valley systems. The cavalry was arriving, drawn by the chaos Marcus had created and the opportunity Team Alpha's movement had provided. Apache gunships swept over the ridge line, their cannons chattering as they engaged the Taliban positions. Transport helicopters followed, racing toward the extraction point where the SEALs were fighting their way to safety. The Taliban fighters who had been closing on Marcus's position suddenly had bigger problems to deal with. The disciplined ambush they had maintained for over 18 hours dissolved into desperate attempts to survive the aerial assault that was systematically destroying their positions. Marcus used the confusion to begin his own movement toward the extraction point, though he knew his chances of reaching safety were minimal. He was too far away, too exposed, and the Taliban fighters between his position and the valley floor were not going to ignore him completely, even while dealing with the helicopters. But he ran anyway, stumbling down slopes that had taken him hours to climb, using gravity and desperation to cover ground that would have been impossible to traverse under controlled circumstances. Behind him, he could hear individual Taliban fighters still pursuing, still determined to kill the man who had disrupted their perfect ambush. A bullet cracked past his head, then another, and Marcus felt something hot tear through his shoulder, spinning him around and sending him tumbling down a scree slope that deposited him hard against a boulder 20 feet below. His rifle was gone, lost somewhere in the fall, and his left arm wasn't working properly. But through the dust and chaos, he could see the extraction point below, where helicopters were landing and Team Alpha was fighting their way to safety. Bear made it to the first helicopter, helped aboard by crew members who immediately began working on his wounds. Chun reached the second aircraft, still carrying his sniper rifle and scanning for threats. Ramirez followed, young and quick and alive. Morrison was the last to reach extraction, turning to provide covering fire for his team, even as the helicopter crew gestured frantically for him to board. But before climbing aboard, he turned toward the mountainside where Marcus was struggling to move, and their eyes met across the chaos of battle. The SEAL commander spoke into his radio, his words carrying clearly to Marcus despite the noise of helicopters and gunfire. "Scissors, you crazy son of a bitch. That was the bravest thing I've ever seen. We're coming back for you." But Marcus knew there wasn't time for another extraction run, not with Taliban reinforcements arriving and the helicopters already taking fire. He keyed his radio one final time, his voice steady despite his wounds and the approaching enemy fighters. "Alpha leader, negative. Get your people out of here. Tell Bear his daughters are going to be proud of their dad. Tell Chin his shooting was perfect. Tell Ramirez he's got a long career ahead of him. And tell everyone back home that their barber sends his regards." Morrison's helicopter lifted off, carrying Team Alpha to safety while Marcus settled back against his boulder, pistol in his good hand, waiting for whatever came next. He had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations. His friends were alive, they were safe, and they would go home to their families. For a hairdresser from Ohio who had never imagined himself as a hero, it was more than enough. The mountains of Afghanistan had witnessed many acts of courage over the centuries, but they had never seen anything quite like Marcus Thompson's last stand. A quiet man who discovered that sometimes the most unlikely people rise to meet the most impossible moments, proving that heroism isn't about training or equipment or experience, but about the willingness to risk everything for people you care about. The Taliban fighters reached his position as dawn was breaking over the Korengal Valley, painting the mountain peaks with golden light that made even this harsh landscape look beautiful. But Marcus Thompson, the barber who had saved Navy SEALs, was no longer there to see it. His final radio transmission had been picked up by intelligence assets throughout the region, and within hours, his story was spreading through the networks of special operations personnel who understood better than anyone what kind of courage his actions represented. Team Alpha returned to Forward Operating Base Chapman that afternoon, alive because a man with no military training had been willing to walk into an impossible situation for no reason other than friendship. They never saw Marcus again, but they never forgot him either. Bear named his next son Marcus in honor of the barber who made sure their father came home. Chun kept Marcus's picture in his helmet throughout his remaining deployments. Ramirez eventually became a SEAL instructor, and he told every class about the civilian who taught him that courage comes in many forms. Morrison wrote a letter to Marcus's sister Sarah, explaining how her brother had died and why his sacrifice mattered. The letter found its way to Millfield, Ohio, where a small town learned that their quiet hairdresser had become something extraordinary in the mountains of Afghanistan. The barber shop on Main Street remained closed for months after the news arrived, its windows dark and its chairs empty. But eventually, Sarah reopened it as a memorial, keeping Marcus's station exactly as he had left it, with his scissors and combs and the pictures of customers he had served over the years. Sometimes, late in the afternoon when the light slanted through the shop windows just right, visitors said they could almost see him there, a gentle man with steady hands who had discovered that heroism isn't something you're born with, but something you choose when people you care about need you most. The barber who proved that extraordinary courage can emerge from the most ordinary places, and that sometimes the most unlikely people rise to meet the most impossible moments, leaving behind a legacy that inspires others long after they're gone.